Anarchist History of Capitalism. And his books are upstairs. Don't warn, balconized, right? Wobblies and Zapatistas, and his brand new book, Living on the Edges of Capitalism. So let's hear what the history of capitalism looks like through an anarchist lens, and give Mr. Grubacic a OC Anarchist Bookfair welcome.
I was almost a European, so I tend to speak softly. So I'm going to use this, just in case you can't hear me. If I start to bore you, because this is going to be historical and theoretical, start yawning or, express some kind of dissatisfaction, or feel free to interrupt me with questions, okay? The book that Gabriel mentioned is called Living at the Edges of Capitalism. Essays, there is actually a subtitle, Adventures in Mutual Aid and Exile. Now the interesting thing was when I was publishing the book with UC Press, it was supposed to be called Studies in Exile and Mutual Aid. And they said, no, it's going to be adventures. I said, but it's not Pirates of the Caribbean. Why adventures? I said, well, it has to sell. I said, but you're an academic publisher. You don't have to sell books, you just have to publish them. He said, well, no, not really. It's neoliberalism, we have been defunded and all of that. I said, okay. The second thing that they did, they said, well, can you put women with guns on the cover? So I said, I don't have a book here to show you, but I was like, women with... The book is not about women with guns. If the book was solely about Rojava, Kurdistan, or... it would make some sense. However, it's not. So why on earth would we have... No, it's absolutely terrible. So we decided to put grandmothers with sticks as a compromise solution. That's when you deal with a mainstream publishing house, you get situations like that. Now, it's tricky to talk about anarchist history of capitalism at an anarchist book fair. The reason why is these things tend to get slightly theoretical and slightly too historical, and it's always easy to lose the audience. So again, please feel to interrupt me if I'm not making sense or if I'm starting to sound too much like an academic. I do make a living as an academic, so please forgive me. The main thing that one needs to deal with when one is an anarchist and when one is writing about anarchism or capitalism from anarchist perspective is Marxism, or to put it more bluntly, Marxists. Insufferable lot. There are many of them who are quite nice. However, when it comes to capitalism, it's a very well protected category. A friend of mine tried to publish an essay. He's a famous anthropologist in the meantime. His name is David Graeber. He tried to publish something in the New Left Review, and capitalism from an anarchist perspective. And it's a famous Marxist journal. And they said basically, no, you're an anarchist. Go and organize. Let us go and theorize. And at some level, that division of labor might make sense. But to make anarchists only into doers, only into people who are doing things, only, I guess, in the imagination of members of the Trotskyist party, into people who are breaking windows, is way too easy. And I was always thinking that as anarchists, we actually do have a certain responsibility to engage with intellectual issues and to put, as James Scott, who is a lovely anarchist anthropologist, he likes to say, to put anarchist squint, to have these glasses through which we are going to observe different phenomena, including capitalism, and try to understand them. Now, my journey into writing this book, which to some extent is about a history of capitalism from an anarchist perspective, has been a long one. And the book has been about 3 different cases that have absolutely nothing in common. First one are the Cossacks from the River Don in Russia between 16th and 18th century. How many of you actually know about the Cossacks? Not too many people, right? Then the Zapatistas. I assume everybody here knows about the Zapatistas. Very contemporary example. And the last one, which was very interesting, that not too many people were surprised, are actually prisoners in solitary confinement. Especially the ones that I worked with a lot in Pelican Bay, and you're familiar, most of you, with the recent wave of strikes, and the people in Lucasville, Ohio, who also went on hunger strike, and who created something truly extraordinary. People call it prison communism. And in this book, together with my co-author, we called it non-state spaces. So I'm actually really happy that I'm speaking after the comrade who spoke about Rojava. I don't know if he's here. But what we try to do in this book is to try to understand how is it that places like Rojava, places like Zapatistas in Chiapas, experiences of what we would call prison communism, how are they actually being created? And what are the global systemic processes within, against, and beyond capitalism that allow for such experiences? And it was an amazing journey. We did probably 300 interviews with prisoners from Ireland, who were all imprisoned together with Bobby Sands, whose anniversary was yesterday, famous Irish hunger striker who died. 200 interviews with people from Turkey, mostly Kurdish, who are imprisoned in so-called F-style prisons in Turkey, and many, many more with prisoners in the United States in solitary confinement. Work with the Cossacks was mostly archival. We went to the archives to try to understand what happened there. The work with Zapatistas was mostly ethnographical. We were related to the Zapatistas in many ways as anarchists in the relationship of critical solidarity. And we lived with the Zapatistas for a long time, and we were able to glean some contradictions that people who usually go to Chiapas are not too ready to expose, not too ready to face. When we speak about non-state spaces, when we speak about experiences like Chiapas, when we speak about experiences like Rojava, it's very easy to say beautiful things about these spaces. It's very easy to ignore the difficulties. It's very easy to ignore the complexities and contradictions. And we are not doing these experiences any favors unless we're actually willing to go deep into these contradictions, to see what these people are really doing, to see what are the obstacles that they're really facing, and to see how amazing it is that they were able to create this fragile, incredible, prefigurative experiments in the middle of practically war zones. Chiapas is a war zone. So the whole idea of writing a book about the edges of capitalism was motivating a whole approach to anarchist history of capitalism, let's call it that, is motivated by this idea to understand how is it possible to think about capitalism differently than most Marxists do. And again, this is not a horrible comment on Marxist tradition. I think I learned a lot from Marx, I learned a lot from Marxism. It is just that the project of Karl Marx was always something else. He was focused on the commodity production. He was focused on trying to understand how is it possible that alienation, fetishism, and all of these other things persist in society. What he never really tried to understand is cooperation, mutual aid, things that anarchists always paid more attention to. For Marx, cooperation was just another consequence of work in the factory. Workers, in the famous phrase of Marx, are just one mode of existence of capital. So the beginning of my thinking about anarchist history of capitalism actually goes not to Marx, but it goes to a French historian, Fernand Braudel. Anybody heard of Fernand Braudel? Extremely well known in Europe and in the United States, probably the best known world historian, unfortunately deceased. And he wrote a beautiful book, Capitalism or Capitalist Civilization, which I really urge you to read. And it has an intriguing part in the book. The idea is that capitalism itself actually is comprised of three sectors. The first sector he calls material life. This is the largest sector that capitalism always tries to penetrate, always tries to put its roots into, never really is able to do so. Above it, there is a second level, and that's the level of market economy. This is the level of markets, of supply, demand, you know, all of these boring things. And finally, the last is anti-market. And this is the real home of capitalism. This is, he says, where law of jungle operates and great predators roam. Now, Marxism did a wonderful job in explaining to us how these two sectors work. The sector of market economy and sector of capitalism. In terms of the material life, this huge, large sector of non-economy that capitalism can never really capture and penetrate, Marxism didn't say much. Again, it wasn't part of the Marxist intellectual project. So we have to look elsewhere. The first place to look is Pyotr Kropotkin. Pyotr Kropotkin wrote in 1902 a book called Mutual Aid. Are most of you familiar with mutual aid? Yes? Well, for those of you who are not, he was a geographer. He was an anarchist. He was a traveler. I went recently to Russia to visit his grave. We were celebrating 192 years, I think, since his death. And at his grave it says, "Here lies Pyotr Kropotkin, anarchist and traveler." Actually, he was very modest. He was one of the most important geographers of his day. And on the basis of his geographic explorations, he formulated something that I think can be called the law of mutual aid. He wrote in his book, "If we ask nature, who are the fittest, those who are continually at war with each other or those who support one another, we at once see that those animals which acquire habits of mutual aid are undoubtedly the fittest. They have more chance to survive, and they attain, in their respective classes, the highest development of intelligence and bodily organization." His main thing, his main contribution, was to move from biology to human society. And he said that the history of humanity is the history of struggle between the institutions of possessive individualism and institutions of mutual aid. Mutual aid, according to Kropotkin, was crucial for survival. And even more importantly, it's crucial for living a decent and good life. Kropotkin, in that sense, defined mutual aid as things, and this is important to say because we usually forget, those of us who use mutual aid and think about it a lot, we usually think about it as reciprocity, and we usually think about it as solidarity when we help each other. He actually had something very different in mind. He was talking about mutual aid as doing things together as a community. And this is a very important thing to which I'm going to come back. But Kropotkin and Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid was extraordinarily influential. Basically what Kropotkin was saying is that at each stage of human development, from proto-stage, early stage, all the way to capitalist stage, there are social regulations, social impositions that are being imposed from above. At the same time, all the time, throughout the history, mutual aid reappears from below, reorganizing human and social relationships from below. And it was a pretty incredible insight at the time. Now, Kropotkin wrote this in 1902. 1978, there is the first person who might be called an anarchist anthropologist. His name is Pierre Clastre. He was writing in France, Paris, and his famous book, the most interesting book at least, is Society Against the State. Clastre's book is translated in English. It's, I think, published by Zone Books. And Clastre made a really intriguing proposition based on his research of indigenous people in Amazonia. He said these are the people without a state. However, the state is not a lack. They organized so they don't have the state. They created a set of strategies, a set of mechanisms, something that he called a non-coercive power, in order to prevent the transformation of non-coercive power into coercive power. They created a system of economy, strategically devised so that only the subsistence is going to be met. there's not going to be any surplus. And he said, and this is a famous thing that you might find on anarchist t-shirts in Europe, if the history of the people with history is the history of class struggle, then the history of people without history is history of their struggle against the state. And that was a tremendously important insight. And he contributed to this understanding of Brodel called material life and to what Kropotkin called mutual aid considerably. What Cluster failed to explain is why were these people organizing against the state without a knowledge that the state exists? Why would they organize against the state? Why would they create all of these mechanisms to prevent the state from forming if they had no idea what the state was? And this is where James Scott comes in. James Scott wrote in 2009 a book called The Art of Not Being Governed, the anarchist history of upland Southeast Asia, I believe. And he focused on one particular geographical locale, a mountain range called Zomia. And Zomia had probably, and still does, several million inhabitants who were effectively stateless. And he gives us a huge, huge, huge history, very long, very exhausting history of Zomia. And he says these are the people, he uses the term non-state space, who inhabit a non-state space. However, unlike Cluster, he makes it clear, these are the people who escaped the state. They knew what the state was. They were captives of the state. They were citizens, we would say today, of the state. They lived in the state. And then they ran away from the state, running for their life to the mountains. And they went to the state, and he says, wherever you look in history, from Roman imperial projects all the way to Western nation state, that's a cute dog. Has temperament. Wherever you go, you will find non-state spaces. You will find non-state spaces, he calls them also shatter zone or refuge, spaces of refuge, where people escaped states, they escaped civilization. He makes absolutely fascinating statements. He says, people who are not civilized, people who we call barbarians, are people who refuse to be citizens of the state. And they ran away to the mountains, or to the jungles, or to the swamps. His favorite example in the United States is the Great Lakes region. But there are many, many more, he says. However, he focuses on Zambia, and he identifies several structures of escape, he says. These are state-preventing, state-repelling strategies. When you have a non-state space, that space is going to try to protect itself by creating strategies that are going to keep the state away. The most immediate one is escape to the mountain, geography. You're going to hide, and he calls this the friction of escape. The second one is when you hide, you have to survive. You have to solve the problem of subsistence. So what you need to do, you need to create agriculture of escape. So agriculture of escape here in the so-called New World was cassava, maize in Southeast Asia, grains that allow you to, once they're chasing you, to run away, to disperse. Third escape social structure was the ethnicity, which he calls multi or non-ethnicity. Everybody came. He's an incredibly diverse group of people who were refusing to have any kind of ethnicity except for not being part of the state. Last state-preventing mechanism, or another state-preventing mechanism, was the one of decentralized, political, directly democratic structure, political structure. Then he says, and controversially so, non-orality. These are the people without history and with a reason. They never put anything in writing, because if they put something in writing, they would be captured by the state. So they actually don't have history because they don't want to have history. And Scott's analysis is absolutely phenomenal. Many anarchists, many historians, many geographers are now thinking about these things very, very seriously. However, Scott comes to a very unexpected, at least for me it was, conclusion. He says, this used to exist. This used to be the case. Non-state spaces used to exist. Living without a state was a normal thing was a normal condition. How state is becoming so powerful. We don't live with small-scale states anymore. It grows, it becomes bigger. It develops what he calls distance-demolishing technologies. It destroys the friction of escape, the friction of geography. States can now climb mountains. There is no place for you to hide. We live, he says, in this global administered space that is completely enclosed. The world, and this is the end of his book, is statified. Now, to me, that's a terribly pessimistic conclusion. So I looked elsewhere, and I was able to find Raul Zibecki, published by AK Press, 2 of his books. You can find them upstairs. He's from Ecuador, although he spent most of his time in Bolivia. Fantastic journalist and historian. And he writes about non-state spaces that are urban and that are contemporary. He writes about what he calls the flight of capital from in South America that was created by the flight of workers from production. He says in El Alto in Bolivia, you have at least 70% of people not involved in waged work, doing all sorts of other things, creating autonomous dispersed spaces, creating autonomous enclaves of urban economy that is outside of capitalism. And he makes a very convincing case that we have something that is not only non-state, but profoundly anti-capitalist, non-capitalist. He doesn't say anti, he says non-capitalist within Latin America today. And more so. People are leaving, people are escaping. They're creating these non-state spaces, non-state zones in which there is no capitalism. Different other forms of labor exist, but not really dominated by what Marx would call law of value. Now, all of this sounds great. My problem with this, I think it's excessively optimistic. There's some missing factors here. First of all, James Scott. Jim makes fascinating points. However, in his whole book about the history of state, history of non-state space of Zambia, he never once, for a second, for a moment, for a footnote, mentions capitalism. There's no mention of capitalism. There's no mention of economy, really. He speaks about agriculture of escape. He doesn't speak about economic practices. And there is no mention of the world market. So you have the state, and you have the non-state, and that's it. State grows, becomes bigger, and eventually swallows the people who escape. What it doesn't have is any engagement with historical capitalism. On the other hand, so escape, and this is the consequence of this line of reasoning, is only geographical. It's never structural. It's only about geography. Now, Zibecki makes a different kind of mistake. He's writing about contemporary capitalism and fissures, cracks within contemporary capitalism, but he makes them, first of all, new. He says this is a new relationship between territory and people that never existed before. I think this is a tremendous and very problematic mistake, because what he does there, he doesn't see that non-state spaces are something that actually belongs to the very logic of capitalism since the inception of historical capitalism in 16th century. And I see that comrade who spoke about Rojava is here, so we're going to mention Rojava and try to contextualize it. So the idea is, there is no mention really of the historical nature of all of these projects. And another thing about Zibecki is he's excessively optimistic. When he writes about non-state spaces in Latin America, he says the following. He says, these are the spaces that are spaces of non-capitalism. Well, that's actually not true. These are the spaces that are very much part of capitalism, but that are at the same time contradictory relationship with capitalism. These are spaces that are at the same time part of capitalism, and at the same time they're outside. They're part of this contradictory location, and our task is to actually understand how are they being produced, and what are the complications that exist within these spaces. Very much like Rojava today, or like the Zapatistas, they inhabit many, many interesting contradictions. And the role of anarchist thinking about capitalism, anarchist thinking about history of capitalism, is to actually engage with this. So far, we have Material Life and Fernand Braudel. We have concept of mutual aid by Kropotkin. We have the concepts of non-state spaces, first formulated by Pierre Clastre and then by James Scott. They can help us, guide us, in thinking how to think through anarchism, think through capitalism from anarchist perspective. Another thing that we need to do is to have a broader definition of what we mean by economy. One of the most painful illusions of Marxist revolutionary left, and I'm sad to say anarchists as well, was to identify economy with commodity production. To say that the central part of economy is production of commodities. That was never the case. Central aspect of economy is production of human beings, production of collective joy, production of communities. This is what Kropotkin meant by mutual aid. Mutual aid, and he has a beautiful thing here that I'm going to read from mutual aid when he writes about animals. He says, "We know at the present time that all animals, beginning with the ants, going on to the birds, and ending with the higher mammals, are fond of plays, wrestling, running after each other, trying to capture each other, teasing each other, and so on. And while many plays are, so to speak, a school for the proper behavior of the young, there are others which, apart from the utilitarian purposes, are, together with dancing and singing, mere manifestations of an excess of forces, the joy of life, of desire to communicate in some way or another with other individuals of the same or other species. In short, a manifestation of sociability proper, which is a distinctive feature of all the animal world." This is an incredible sentence. What Kropotkin does here, he destroys the idea that economy is somehow separated from life. Remember, the idea of economy, which is a fairly modern concept, is the separation of work from life. It is something more. It is also separation of work from play. The idea of playful cooperation, the idea we are doing things because we have absolutely no utilitarian purpose, because we are having fun, is something that actually no concept of economy, aside from what I've just read you, has taken seriously. And that's a big problem. Because if we are what we are really doing then, we are repeating what capitalism tells us, that production is only production of commodities and not production of human beings. That value is all about production of what economists call exchange value, and not about what people create when they move outside of capitalism. And when they move outside of capitalism, when they meet subsistence, they tend to produce intersubjective relationships, joy, fun, they tend to dance. It's not unusual, and I don't know how many of you have read Barbara Ehrenreich's beautiful book about dancing in the streets. I don't know if it's upstairs or in the other building, it should be. It's a beautiful book where she says that dancing at some point, and that point is very interestingly beginning of capitalism, 16th century, stopped. In Northern Europe, dancing stopped, music stops. Festivals that used to be everywhere in the streets are taken out of the streets and public squares. All of a sudden we have, she says, an epidemic of melancholy in Europe. 17th century England, 18th century Germany, and onwards, we have a situation where any display of public joy is being completely civilized, which means that it's been taken away from public spaces. What people call development really is the removal of public collective joy and its replacement by commodity production. So what we need to do is to recover the sense of economy in a broader sense that puts care, production of communities, production of people at the very center as the defining feature of economy. And capitalism as its exact opposite. And what we need to do after that is to link this with two other sectors that I already mentioned of capitalism, market economy and the other economy, which is the real home of capitalism, and try to understand what really about represent for capitalism. And what I try to do in the book is to, as much as was possible, to see how and what would this idea of non-state spaces, and I changed the name, and I will explain why, do to capitalism, if we were to take it seriously. And I stumbled upon another quote from Fernand Braudel, who says that in his investigations of world economy, of capitalism, there's something that he calls black holes. Black holes in the world time that exist outside and against capital accumulation. He says these are inaccessible places. They definitely exist, he says, but it's very difficult to actually discover them. It's very difficult to study them. There's not enough information about them. I think he's wrong. We can definitely study them, and they definitely exist, and they continue to reappear all the time. So what we call non-state spaces really are results of the incorporation, of the expansion of capitalism. They're reactions to the expansion of capitalism. These are the people who decided to escape from capitalism, to refuse capitalism, to refuse law of value, and create societies that become home for mutual aid, and that become geographic but also structural expressions of concentrated mutual aid, where people try to escape from processes of capitalist accumulation, valorization, and state regulation. And I call this in the book the process of infrapolitics of capitalism, which basically means creation of these non-state spaces and circulation of non-state spaces and practices throughout the capitalist history, Rojava being the most recent. But it begins at the very beginning, 16th century. And that's the fascinating thing about it. Because if you actually study capitalism like this, if you look at capitalism like this, if you look at what people call interstate system, the way that the states are organized within capitalist world economy, which are all about the protection of law of value and so forth, we can say that the history of the state system, history of the interstate system, actually is a history of struggle against non-state spaces. And we can say that the history of capitalist economy is a history of struggle against external autonomous economy and external autonomous activities. And this puts capitalism, the way that we think about capitalism, on its head. And it's very interesting. So we are looking at these projects, we are looking at these processes in order to understand, in order to be able to think not only historically, not only theoretically, but also politically. I mentioned the term infrapolitics of capitalism. The idea is that non-state spaces in capitalism, once they are incorporated into capitalism, assume a different form. They become invisible, or almost invisible. You really do need to pay attention to them. But then, during the restructuring of capitalism, and I don't have time to go into the cycles and downturns, you will have to read the book for this. There's a lot of political economy there. In certain moments, like with the Zapatistas in Mexico, like the Kurds in Rojava, moments of restructuring of capitalism, these spaces explode from spaces of communal protection and survival. These only partially incorporated spaces become transformative spaces. Not always, but they have the potential to become transformative spaces. Zapatistas have transformed their territory, just like the Kurds, in not only in a strategic resource, but also in a strategic resource for, not only for defense, but for recovery of the relationship of mutual aid. And that was a fascinating experience. What Zapatistas have created is a black hole within the world economy, is an obstacle to accumulation in this part of the world. And their role, as we all know and we all agree, I'm sure, has been tremendous in inspiring many, many movements all over the place. However, we live now at a place, at the moment, which I believe is crucial, critical, and very painful. We live at a moment where there is a huge, some people call it financialization of world economy, but definitely a time of weakening of interstate system. And as anarchists, we would like nothing more than to see states become weaker. But it's a scary proposal. Why? Because it's not only Rojavas that are being created. If you stand where our comrade used to stand on the frontier, on the border with Turkey, you can observe two things. You can observe territorialization of rule and territorialization of escape. Territorialization of a non-state space, that is Rojava, and territorialization of a state or would-be state information, which is the Islamic State. There are many different territorial fragments that are coming in this period of deterritorialization and weakening of the interstate system. Some of them are like Rojava. Others are like Boko Haram or Islamic State. There is no way to know how is this process going to work. So there is an urgency to actually understanding how and why and what we can do in relation to production and understanding and politics of creation of these non-state spaces. It's a fascinating research and it's a fascinating topic. But once you put mutual aid and escape at the center of analysis, once you start truly to understand the history of the world as the history of struggle between the institutions of possessive individualism and institutions of mutual aid, as Kropotkin tried to do, you have a very different interpretation of what capitalism is. You see how limited, how powerful, but also how limited capitalism is. You see that all of these spaces cannot be understood outside of capitalism. They exist within unitary capitalist world economy. And yet, they are never, and they have never been, completely incorporated into it. Fernand Braudel calls this, he says, nothing is completely commodified. Capitalism is never complete. There always is an implicit outside. And this is the greatest hope that we have. I come from San Francisco, and in San Francisco now, city is not livable anymore because of the tech occupation, or whatever people are calling it nowadays. Really bizarre forms of gentrification that are happening in San Francisco these days. And they have this idea of frictionless apps. And the idea of frictionless app is to create a perfect app that's not going to have any friction. I guess it's going to work perfectly. So if you're, I don't know, in Orange County, and you need a dentist, you're immediately going to find a dentist. Nobody actually thinks about are you going to be able to afford that dentist. That's, tech world is not thinking about this. But the idea of frictionless, of destruction of space, of destruction, of this friction of resistance, of these non-state spaces that we're talking about, has been with us since the 16th century. Marcus Rediker and Peter Limbaugh wrote about the pirates. Pirates, just a fantastic example of non-state spaces. Ship was a non-state space. Many different beautiful books about maroons, runaway slaves, in Jamaica, but almost anywhere else. Cossacks, Zapatistas, prisoners, people that I wrote about in this book, Living at the Edges of Capitalism. Rojava. These are wonderful and very hopeful examples. And we tend to ignore them at our own peril. Anarchists, unfortunately, of a more sectarian variety, have issued many statements condemning Rojava. Before that, condemning Zapatistas. Before that, condemning I don't know whom. But focusing on, I just read some stupidity about Rojava saying they never abolished the means of production. I'm thinking, abolish the means of production? We are talking about cantons and assemblies, and what on earth are you even thinking? And I was just talking to a friend from AK Press, and I was thinking, was there in the time of Spanish Civil War, Spanish Revolution, a group of sectarian leftists writing and saying, we should not help our comrades in Spain because they're colluding with imperialism. We should not go and fight fascism because their fight is not pure enough. maybe, but not to my knowledge, and my grandparents used to fight in the Spanish Civil War, so I think they would have mentioned it. No, this is a pathology, a very recent pathology. We need to resist it. That is able to fight. And that we can actually learn. Looking at what people in Rojava are doing, looking at what people in Chiapas are doing, but also looking at what our comrades here did when KKK showed up recently. When was this, a few months ago? In all of those moments, there is a great potential of creating a serious, strong, well-organized anarchist movement. We need to get there. We are not there yet. We are scattered. We exist as a scene. We exist in Greece. My comrades call this the space. We exist as the space. But we need to be much more than that. And I think taking our history seriously, history of anarchism, not being sectarians, looking at learning from places like Rojava, Chiapas, or prisoners from Pelican Bay, but also thinking, intellectually engaging with problems that Marxists and all other kinds of sectarians or mainstream liberals have privatized and made their own, is something that we need to resist, something that we need to fight against, and what we really need to do is to create a strong, intellectual, inspired, exciting anarchist culture, and we need to have fun. So that concludes my contribution for today. Thank you very much for listening to this slightly boring. I believe we have a few minutes for questions, if there are any. Anybody would like to ask about capitalism and how it... Yeah?
Give some illustrations of like how the indigenous people in the Amazon or anywhere create non-state spaces, like versus non-intellectuals. Like, what does that look like when they're doing that?
It's very hard because the reason why it's hard is not too many people have taken this up as a challenge. And there are not too many ethnographers who go there and who write books about them. Or if they do, ethnographies are also, they're state-centered. They focus on the lack. They focus on what they see as absent, which is the state. There are some examples. I don't know about the indigenous in the Amazon. I haven't studied them myself. That's when I mentioned Pierre Clastre, and he did this wonderful ethnography, Society Against the State. But I did study the Cossacks quite a bit in lots of details. And basically what they do, what most of these societies have, non-state societies, they have systems of direct democracy. They're usually organized as assemblies. So for example, Cossacks had something they called krug, which means the circle, where people would come together, and somebody who had the power of facilitation, never the power of command, power of facilitation, it could have been a vote, but in this case actually it was consensus decision making. He would facilitate, it was always a he. Women did not have a place in the Cossack society, and that's an interesting thing to think about, and I spend a lot of time in the book writing about this. But it was a direct democracy, and people were making decisions together. It was also an economy in which agriculture was explicitly forbidden, because agriculture was associated with Russia. What Russia meant, that was a state and space of serfdom. These were escaped serfs who came here hating agriculture, and around the River Don created a non-state society with a very different system of sovereignty, which was, again, directly democratic, and it was deeply, profoundly communistic, based on relationships of mutual aid. How it worked, in more detail, you will have to read in the book. There is a lot of details, and basically it ended with capitalism, with incorporation of Russia into the capitalist economy. And Russia was pressured to eliminate this space. The Cossacks were transformed from a non-ethnicity group of people who were a voluntary association, to use an old anarchist term, based on common interest, into an ethnic group, privileged ethnic minority, which, and this is really painful, received the task to patrol the borders of the empire. And right now, when you go, and I spent many months with Cossacks on the Don, what they actually do is they are patrolling the borders as an informal police for Vladimir Putin, trying to expel Muslim immigrants who come to Russia. So you see people who had non-state people defined by the fact that they're not Russian, becoming, in the process of being swallowed by the state, in the processes of capitalist state formation, becoming an ethnic group which becomes even more Russian than Russians themselves. And then in Chiapas, you see a complete opposite example. You see a situation where indigenous people who were not only colonized, but were also largely forgotten, they call themselves the forgotten ones, were able to reinvent and recapture that space, reappropriate the space, and create a very different and very interesting economy, politics, society, based on very similar principles to those of the Cossacks at the very beginning of the Cossack history in 16th century. And of the Zapatistas, you have many, many books, and I would be glad to stay and recommend some that are very good. In the book, we have a whole chapters on the Zapatistas, and we try to see what are the similarities. The basic and the most important thing that we were able to discover is that the Zapatistas were not looking at the state. They were able to find a way to create a relationship not with the state, which is what the Cossacks did in order to survive, but with the international and national civil society. This allowed the Zapatistas, this space in eastern Chiapas, non-state space in eastern Chiapas, to actually survive. The Cossacks, on the other hand, have created a strategic relationship of dependency on the Russian state, which would send them guns, and then they would go to patrol the borders and frontiers. And by doing this, they made themselves extremely weak. When the state became strong enough, it just destroyed them. So that is one of the examples, but there are many, many more, and again, pirates and all other sorts of interesting characters.
Hi, Andrej, thank you. Question just quickly on the Cossacks. You know, I mean, very often in the depictions of Tsarism, you see that the Cossacks are the strong Praetorian Guard of the Tsars. Is this a similar process of what you're discussing later with Putin?
Exactly, exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned this, because the Cossacks were precisely the police force. During Tsarism, they were in Russia, they were transformed into a police force. They were, one Russian historian says, their history was privatized by the state. So you have non-state peoples, again, defined by the fact that they hate Russia, who tried to destroy Russia in the series of rebellions. Paul Avrich writes about them in the book Russian Rebels. They tried to destroy Russia. They lost, but they were able to keep that space. They were able to keep their identity of Kazakh, which basically means somebody who is free, somebody who is not a citizen or subject of the state. And later on, through literature, through films, through different form of propaganda and state intellectual production, they were transformed into the Orthodox, Russian Orthodox knights, into the very essence definition of what it means to be Russian. And they did become the police force that is responsible for some horrific crimes against Jews and horrific crimes against anarchists and communists. So yeah, that's the these are the same people. And they're very much aware of this. When we were there and we were doing interviews with them, they would say, my grandfather was a Cossack. My father was the son of the Cossack. And I'm a dog's dick. That's actually a proverb in the Dawn, which tells you about their self-esteem, but it gives you also, it's a nice Russian proverb, it gives you an idea of how non-state spaces can be transformed, restructured, disempowered, and present some, beautifully complicated questions about identities and how identity is being constructed and how identity is being manipulated. Anybody else?
Over here. Yeah. So you talked about the importance of play and having fun. Have you done any looking, or maybe have any recommended reading about working with kids and the role of kids escaping from the prison of the school system and alternative modes of self-education or anything like that?
Yeah, this is not in this book, but absolutely. This education or escape from mainstream education is one of the most, well, the most important formative experiences of state socialism. And just to describe to you what it meant in terms of schooling, it was just absolutely horrendous. You need to stand up when Marshal Tito Marshal Tito died on a certain date at a certain time, so we all had to stand up, stand for like 2 hours. I was asked in front of the teacher to say whom I like more, my own mother or Marshal Tito. I gave her the wrong answer. I said, never met Marshal Tito, I really like my mother. I spent 2 days in detention. So I know it's different in the United States, but still, you still have to give those Pledge of Allegiance and all of those terrible rituals of the state. So that kind of escape, that kind of having fun is something that anarchists always took seriously. You know, when you read Francisco Ferrer, he's a little bit too serious, the modern schools. But the idea of modern schools actually, and stuff that people don't usually talk about, is that modern schools of Francisco Ferrer, that emigrated to the United States, to New Jersey, to Buenos Aires, to many other places, were actually more Tolstoyan in the way that they conceived of education. And Tolstoy believed in what he called he believed in the importance of having fun, of unstructured activity, of spontaneous, what he called the idea of spontaneous order. Leave the kids, no discipline, leave the kids to figure the stuff out, and they will. So that kind of festivity, games, fun, all of that is, I think, part and parcel of anarchist education from the very beginning. From Paul Hoban and the ideas of integral education, then especially Tolstoy, who is still my favorite in terms of education, and my American favorite, Paul Goodman. I don't think there was anybody who wrote so eloquently and beautifully on education as Paul Goodman did. And I think it's high time for us, anarchists living in North America, to rediscover Paul Goodman and his idea of small or tiny schools and decentralized communities. His book, Community of Scholars, when he actually advocates secession from schools and universities, creating a whole parallel system, which would, to some extent, be exilic or non-state space-like in character. So yeah, there are many interesting things there.
Can you recommend any non-serious anarchist work, things that you go into the idea of by the movies, books, non-academic papers, non-essays?
Non-academic papers on non-state stuff, or?
No, just going more into the idea of cultural things.
There's so much. It's kind of hard to even think of something that is. Whenever you see a film about anarchism, which is not kind of socialist, realistic presentation of struggle when everybody is all about sacrifice and all of that, you see moments of singing, you see people of coming together. It's a beautiful film by Ken Loach, maybe a little bit too didactic about the Spanish Civil War, which was called Land and Freedom. But it's a beautiful film. You see how much singing there is there. You see how much camaraderie. You see how much, really the Spanish Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, which I think should be called Spanish Revolution, was all about. And you see those anarchists, you see how that community has been produced. And that would be one film that I would always recommend. And that's the only thing that comes to mind. I'm sorry right now, but I'm sure I can think of something else. I'd like to keep you here.